In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a couple of different types of narrative structures. The 5-paragraph essay, which many of you are likely familiar with because it's taught all the way, in many cases, from elementary school into college, because it's really simple, and another one called framing stories, and I'll talk about that in just 1 minute. The 5-paragraph essay gets its name from the fact that, you guessed it, it contains 5 different paragraphs. It contains an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. The introduction in a 5-paragraph essay has, of course, one main purpose: to introduce the topic, to offer some general information. Now, it generally contains 3 main points. You've got a hook, because you want to pull the reader in, so something to grab their attention. And then, of course, you introduce the topic, offering general information. And then you conclude with a thesis statement, where there are often 3 points. So you have your thesis statement, and I'm going to back this up with point 1, point 2, and point 3. And also, before you move into the next paragraph, you need a transition to make the essay flow. Now, once you've transitioned from the introductory paragraph into body paragraph number 1, your body paragraph will contain 3 main things. A topic sentence, which is basically a thesis statement for that paragraph. This is what I'm going to tell you in this paragraph. Then you elaborate on the first point in your thesis statement. That includes restating the claim, and then offering evidence that bolsters that claim. And then once you've presented that information, you offer a concluding sentence, which often serves as the transition into the next body paragraph. Because again, you want to make the essay flow. Then for the next body paragraph, you just wash, rinse, repeat what you did for the previous body paragraph. And then again for body paragraph number 3, just wash, rinse, repeat. Once you've developed your thesis statement in your body paragraphs, you've offered claims and evidence, and elaborated on the points that you laid out in your introductory paragraph, you then transition into your conclusion, where again you have 3 main points. Often, a conclusion just includes a restatement of your thesis statement and also a concluding statement. You don't want to offer any new information. You're just restating or summarizing what you've just said. And then you essentially answer the question, therefore, what? So why should this matter? Why should readers care about this? So overall, what you're doing in the 5-paragraph essay is really one essential thing. In the introductory paragraph, you're telling them, this is what I'm going to tell you. In the body paragraphs, you're then telling them, hey, this is what I told you I would tell you. And then in the concluding paragraph, you just restate, hey, this is what I've just told you. Now, this is a really simple way of presenting information. It's clear, it's logical. Well, its logic is simple. It goes from point A to point B to point C. It's very simple to pull out if you've got to, say, write an essay on a question or an essay on a test. You can pull this out. Or if you need to present your ideas in a clear, very simply logical manner. But it's not the only or even the best way of presenting information. There are many other structures that you could pursue, and that could introduce you or allow you to introduce more complex, nuanced thinking into your argument than simply, this is point A, here's point B, point C, point D. And we'll be looking at one of those different narrative structures now. Another structure that can be, well, it's widely used in storytelling. It's called framing stories. And it's fairly different than the 5-paragraph essay, because in a framing story, what happens is just like any frame, is a container for the image. And a frame should direct attention to what's in the image, and it should enhance and complement what's going on in the image. Also, a frame, like a frame in a house or a building, it provides structure for the thing, so that you can move around on the inside of it. Same thing with framing stories. They introduce ideas in what is called the frame story that then pulls us into, those ideas pull through the entire story to give us a sense of coherence and understanding to what's going on in the quote-unquote plot in the narrative. Now, as I said, framing stories have been used quite a bit in storytelling. Shakespeare used them in some of his plays. Midsummer Night's Dream is a good example of this. It's a play within a play. Aladdin makes use of this as well. We have in the opening scenes, we have the merchant talking to us, and he says, I'm going to tell you a story. So we have the merchant story, and then he tells us the story of Aladdin, and at the end of the movie, we come back to the merchant, and that closes the frame. Now, in 2010, Christopher Nolan put out his movie Inception, and this makes use of framing stories in a really interesting way. I want to just point this out quickly. If you haven't seen the movie Inception, I'll give you a quick rundown of the plot. Overall, it's a heist movie. It follows that general structure of they need to get in and take some information and get back out. Although there's a twist here, in terms of this story, they're not getting in and stealing information, they are implanting information. And it revolves around the story of a man named Cobb, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he is unable to return home to his children for a very specific reason. And he then, well, so what he does for his job, he goes around the world and he goes into people's dreams and he steals information from them. So there's that heist aspect of the story. But at one point in the movie, someone approaches him and says, "I can get you back to your family if you pull one job for me." And this job, this thing that I need you to do is to plant information in a businessman's head. And the information I need you to plant is that he needs to sell his company to me so that I can make more money. Now, so this idea that's set up at the very beginning of a father seeking to get home to his kids or a parent's relationship with his children, that's an idea that carries through and that drives the entire movie. That's what's taking place in the quote unquote real world of the movie. And once everything's been established in the real world, they've entered the first dream level. They're in a city in a warehouse. They're driving through the city and they end up in a warehouse where they're under assault. And then after they have been here in the city of the warehouse, they go into the next level of dreaming. The next level of the dream is the hotel, where they come into conflict with people trying to keep these robbers out of the person's head. And then they move to the next level of the dream. And the next level of the dream is a snow fortress. And this is where they are going to plant the idea in the businessman's head. Now, in the snow fortress, once they get into the center room of the snow fortress, they find the businessman's father, who is the one who gave the businessman his business. And the only reason the businessman is keeping this company is because he wants to show his father that he can do it, that he wants to prove himself to his dad. Now, the way that they've devised to implant the idea that he needs to sell the company into his head is they go into the room and there's a safe inside the room that holds the secret of the relationship with his father. When the businessman opens the safe, he finds an artifact from his childhood, something that his father had kept from when the young man was a child. And when he sees this, he realizes, oh, Daddy loves me. And he becomes contented and realizes, hey, I don't have to hold on to this company anymore because my dad is proud of me. He loves me no matter what I do. And so you see that this idea of the father, of the parent's relationship with the children carries through the entire movie, and it's the motivating factor for the entire plot. Except before Cobb can get home, he has to move into another layer of dreaming, the deepest layer, into the unconscious, and thereby taking us into another frame in the story, the fifth frame here. And he has to do this to retrieve the man who hired him, because without bringing him home, he will be unable to return back to his children. So he goes into the unconscious, he finds the man who hired him, and they return to the quote unquote real world of the movie. And here in the real world, in the overall frame of the Inception story world, we see Cobb return to his kids. Or does he return to his kids? I mean, we don't really know. What we do know is that he's able to move forward in his own narrative, which is how that's how the story ends. So that's one example of a framing story, where again, a narrative that frames or gives shape to a story pulls ideas through the center. It's a container that helps us to hold on to and comprehend and move our way through the story that is at the center of the frame. And this leads us to the narrative structure of Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture. One way of viewing Morrison's Nobel lecture is through the lens of frame stories. Now, this is not the only way of viewing the Nobel lecture, but I found it to be a very productive and useful way of looking at what's happening in the story because it's very complex, much more complex than the 5 paragraph essay. As she moves through, excuse me, the stories that twist and turn and circle back upon themselves, as she explores the function of language and the power of language. Now, Morrison's lecture starts off with a frame story, her opening frame, where she tells the story of the old woman who is visited by some young people. Now, in this story, she sets up ideas that carry through the entire narrative to its very center. So that's the opening frame. Once upon a time, there was an old woman. After she's told the story of the old woman and her young visitor, she moves into what I call her first interpretive act, number 1. Here she talks about what I call unyielding language. This section begins where she says her answer can be taken to mean. Now, this is the narrator signaling to us that she is moving from telling the story to interpreting the story. This is how I take the story. That's what she's telling us. And then she proceeds to explore again what I call unyielding language, or language that is oppressive. And she uses many different descriptors to describe and to flesh out this kind of language and the social, political, rhetorical conditions from which that kind of language emerges. After she explores unyielding language and fleshes that worldview out, she moves into what I call her narrative crux. Now, this is the very center of the narrative, a crux being a cross or the critical point where all of her ideas come together and they cross. This is where she talks about the Tower of Babel and explores that as a view of heaven as life, not heaven as post life. So, again, the ideas that she introduces in the very opening story carry through into her re envisioning or her revision of the Tower of Babel story. After she has reinterpreted the Tower of Babel story, she moves back out into another interpretive act. I call this interpretive act number 2, where she explores life sustaining language. She signals her move into this, as I see it, by saying she would not want her young visitors to think, etc. And this is where she explores the opposite of unyielding language, life sustaining language being something that can bring life. And this section is much shorter than her other section, but it's still a means of interpreting what is going on in her frame story. And she returns to this frame story in the end, gives it a closing frame where she says, "Once upon a time, visitors ask an old woman a question." So she returns here to explore the children's point or the young visitor's point of view. She begins the opening frame with the old woman's point of view, her perspective, and then she comes back at the end of the narrative to the closing frame to explore the young people's perspective. How are they receiving what the old woman is saying, etc., etc. Now, this is a fairly long section, and it's filled with all sorts of different ideas that are coming from these young visitors. That's one way of viewing Morrison's Nobel lecture, is as a series of frames that start off with her tale of the old woman who is visited by some young people, and then she moves into interpreting that story and then revising and circling back upon itself. And so it's got a lot of series of twists and turns in the narrative, very much unlike the 5 paragraph essay to which we've compared it and which we're probably most likely the most familiar. Um, but it's a different way of presenting the narrative, but it's not simply all logic. It doesn't move us from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E in a simply logical manner. Instead, her circling, her twisting, her turning is intended, I would argue, to give us an experience with the kind of language that she's presenting to us, with potent language that opens worldviews, that opens us toward different perspectives. So that's what I would argue she's doing here. And by looking at her narrative as a series of frames, then we can experience, I think, her language in a different way than if she had simply written this as a 5-paragraph essay. That's something I'd like you to consider, actually, is how would your experience of this narrative be different and perhaps less effective or less potent if she had written it like a 5-paragraph essay? So just something to keep in mind as we move throughout this week's discussion of Morrison's Nobel lecture.